Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Baruch College. Welcome to the Marxe Issues Forum. My name is David Birdsell. I'm the Dean of the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. And I am delighted to introduce today's panel addressing a very important topic on migration that is prompted by climate change. We have an opportunity today to hear from two of the authors of a groundbreaking World Bank study addressing this issue, and also from somebody who stewards a range of environmental concerns, very much including climate change right here in New York City. So from the developing world to very much the developed world, subways notwithstanding, we'll be talking about the impact in a variety of situations and trying to understand what some of the pressures are that might lead populations to move in the wake of climate change. Joining us today are, to my immediate right, Daniel Zarilli. He is Senior Director of Climate Policy and Programs and the Chief Resilience Officer in the New York City Office of the Mayor. To Daniel's right is Kanta Kumari Rigon. She is the lead environmental specialist at the World Bank. She's an expert on climate policy and serves as the vice chair of NOMAD, the technical working group on environmental change and migration. And she led the report that I referred to just a moment ago. To her right is our own Brian Jones, my colleague here at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs, who specializes in geospatial dimensions of climate analysis and predictive modeling for understanding the relationship between populations and climate change. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. Let me begin by giving Kanta the opportunity to provide a brief synopsis of what you and your colleagues discovered about a staggering number, perhaps 143 million people in South Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, and in South America who may be mobile because of climate change.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share with you the findings of the Groundwell Report. As noted, the World Bank put out this report exactly a month ago to this date. And to your question, what are the main findings that we would like to convey? The first is exactly what you said, David. There would be more than 143 million climate migrants across the three regions that you mentioned, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America by 2050 if there is no concrete climate or development action. And this is the number under the worst case scenario. The second message, which I think is equally important, is that between 2020 and 2050, there will be a ramping up of the number of climate migrants. So really that we have a lower number now, which is continued to ramp up. The third message, which is a critically important one, is not every place or every geography is similar. What you have is an emergence of climate migration hotspots spatially. And in that sense, there is the climate in-migration hotspots where people will gravitate to because they have relatively more attractive attributes, and they will move away from more vulnerable areas. And this emergence of this climate migration hotspots, the number, the spread, and the intensity will increase between now and 2050. So taken together, these three metrics of the scale, the trajectory, and the emergence of hotspots really puts an urgency to act now and act immediately. So is this bad news or good news? And I think there is a bit of both. The number is startling, the number is big, it's conservative, it's only looked at slow onset climate change, by which we mean we've looked at water stress, agriculture productivity losses, and sea level rise augmented by storm surges. So there is, the other aspects of extreme events which also add to displacements which hasn't been considered and other factors. The other message, which is the more positive, is that there is an opportunity to act now, and by acting now and acting early, we can reduce those numbers significantly. What we found is in the climate-friendly scenario, we could bring these numbers down by as much as 80%, still at the scale of 30 million, which is not insignificant, but that's a drastic reduction from where we could be if we do a few things right. The first is to cut greenhouse gas emissions promptly, because that would reduce the impacts from climate and require people to move. The second is really resilient development is important, and resilient development that has a lens towards climate migration, understanding what to do before people move so that you can help them to be where they are, facilitate the move, and make sure that when they do move, the sending and receiving areas are in sort of a harmonious context. The third is, we've done this, obviously through a modeling exercise, but what we want to encourage everyone is to apply and to think and understand these issues better at a more local and a national context so that you can act accordingly. So that's really the key messages I'd like to leave for now and then come back to the discussion.
Kanta, I was very impressed in reading the report that you talk about migration prompted by climate change as not necessarily a problem, that this might be a reasonable response to climate change, and you talked about a couple of ways to make it more successful, at least to mitigate harms. Can you talk a little bit about that lens? Because many people just hear climate migrants and think that it's entirely disastrous.
No, absolutely. That's really an important point because, for millennia, people have moved and migrated. Birds have a natural instinct to migrate as well, and so do many other animals. But the reality is migration in itself must be seen as an adaptation strategy. People have moved whenever they've had certain stresses. I think what we're trying to distill down here is the impacts from climate change. And there is a type of distress movement that could come as a consequence. But to your point, I think even before people move, there are lots of things that we can do to help them to adapt in place. And the adaptation in place is extremely important. Oftentimes, people have a certain amount of development deficit that is also prevalent in addition to the climate stresses that could be dealt with. Whether this is about providing alternative livelihoods that are less climate sensitive, or it is having social safety nets that allow one to transgress an extreme event or certain recurrence of those events, and also to have certain skill set development that would allow them to to move into professions that are less climate sensitive. That's at the individual level. Equally, there are actions that can be done at a national level to enable this demographic or economic transitions to happen in a way that allows people to be there and allows them to move in a more sort of facilitated manner.
So there are economic development and human capital development dimensions to this that are too rarely appreciated, at least prior to your report.
Yes, I think that's really important, and I can come back to examples afterwards if you want.
Terrific. Brian, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what strikes me as a deucedly difficult problem to model. You're trying to figure out when people are so stressed that they choose to leave wherever they are and move somewhere else. How do you do that, and how did you and your colleagues approach that in the report?
You're right, David. It is a significant challenge, not the least of which is because there are many, many reasons that people choose to migrate, dozens upon dozens. And climate stress is, in reality, just a minor one at this point. We haven't seen the types of changes that are projected in the future in the past, so it's very difficult to tease out from past data how populations might respond. If you look at the reports that were done prior to this one, most of the evidence is somewhat anecdotal. And the numbers that have been published are largely based on relatively simple procedures like projecting a certain level of sea level rise, overlaying that over a map of the current population and extracting a population that may be forced to move. What we tried to do was look more closely at the reasons people move. It's not necessarily extreme heat or lack of precipitation, but the effect that those climate impacts have on livelihoods, which we measured through, in this case, agricultural production and water stress, which are, of course, extremely important when we're talking about rural livelihoods. So the challenge from a modeling perspective was really finding a way to isolate in the historic data any signal in changes in the distribution of population on those factors so that we could actually ground the research in observed data. We weren't making guesses. We were, in fact, learning from historic data. And without getting into too much detail, essentially what we had to do was use some advanced spatial econometric techniques to essentially find what was a very small signal, a very minor signal relative to, for example, wage differentials over space, that indicated that people do, again, at a very small level, move when you see less in the way of crop yield or more in the way of water stress. And you see people move away from rural environments, generally towards urban environments in those types of situations. So we extracted those signals from the historic data and used them as our premise modeling forward.
I want to pick up right just on this notion of moving from rural to urban locations. There's a broad sort of secular movement into cities all around the world. This, I assume, would accelerate that trend if unimpeded, we see these 143 million and presumably hundreds million more to follow. If we aren't successful both in limiting greenhouse gas emission and adapting the kind of economic and human capital development programs that Kanta talks about.
That is an assumption that's common. We found that it is very regionally specific. And there are cases where the outcomes are somewhat counterintuitive, where perhaps you see one region of a country that is stressed, and people are moving not necessarily to cities, but to other regions of the country where the same livelihoods remain viable. So we didn't always see this heavy rural to urban migration. Now, that's not to say we didn't see it. The report modeled 140 some odd countries. So my advice in those situations is pay very close attention to the regional context. And something that was, I think, a really important factor in this report was our ability to actually look at the subnational level and assess how people may move over space. And people have a variety of choices, and rural to urban migration is one of those choices, but it's not the only choice. So again, this urban stress, if you will, is very contextual and very tied to place-specific context.
Terrific. Let's jump to a very different region and one that you did not consider, that being New York City. Daniel, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the extent to which we have in the city, and you and your colleagues have, prepared for the prospect of people moving, of neighborhoods becoming less viable as places to live or to work, given sea level rise or other environmental factors that you've been tracking.
Yeah, I guess I'm struck by two things here. One, I love the global nature of this conversation and how it applies to New York City, because sometimes we can be at risk of thinking that the world ends at the Hudson River, right? And there's nothing, right. But also the temporal aspect of this and the what might happen by 2050 conversation is always interesting for me, because we have to be aware of what's coming, and yet it's become clearer and clearer to us that the future has already arrived. And we've already seen a foot of sea level rise here in New York Harbor. We've already had climate migrants in New York City from Hurricane Sandy. And so these things become real very quick and very local. Here in New York City, Sandy has defined a lot of our, not all, but a lot of our experience with climate change. But of course, we're seeing more rain and it's getting hotter. And we've pulled together a couple different programs to deal with what's coming. First, we are investing over $20 billion in the types of things like seawalls and wetlands and painting roofs white and planting more trees and doing the sort of things that we need to do to adapt and build a more resilient city that is better able to accommodate more population as well. We're getting at the root causes by cutting our greenhouse gas emissions, and we've committed to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, and we're 15% of the way there, and we have a lot more to do before 2050 for sure. And then a third area, which is new for us, and we've really added a whole new area of accountability where we're suing 5 of the fossil fuel companies that are most responsible for climate change. We're divesting our pension funds. So we are taking this fight straight into the fossil fuel industry. But as these, I think your question of what we're doing to prepare and what we've seen here in New York City, I think we've already had a trial run of that as well with last year's Hurricane Maria and the centers that we set up for Puerto Rican communities who have family ties here. There's obviously a strong connection between Puerto Rico and New York City, and we saw a lot of internally displaced, I guess, individuals is probably the right way to describe it. And we set up care centers and ways to get people back on their feet, and with family here, where people can become residents of New York City, access to the ID NYC program that gets people quicker access into city services. So a number of things that we've already seen and had some dry runs on how this might actually play out even at a bigger scale, like you're describing, as more and more people might be on the move. And with sea level rise projections of 2 to 3 feet by 2050 and maybe as high as 6 feet by 2100, this is, it takes itself out of just the very technical aspect of how do you deal with this water, but that water movement and the increased heat all over the globe will drive more people, exactly as you're finding, to out of those vulnerable locations, because they'll have to be. And right now it might be the signal that's on their livelihood that's pushing them in that direction. But if you are in a low-lying area, whether it's in Louisiana or Bangladesh, you may be, it's not just even a livelihood signal, you are being pushed out by environmental factors. And I think we all need to be cognizant of that. And it's not just the technical things that are going to happen around water and heat and rain. It's what those will then cause around migration and food insecurity and conflict that I think have a lot of us very worried about what this future might hold if we don't get our greenhouse gas emissions under control quickly.
Now, New York's ability to control greenhouse gases is somewhat limited, just given our footprint and our contribution to the global emission picture. A lot of what you're doing is remediating and girding against whatever changes do occur, right? Could you talk a little bit about what kind of land preservation you expect to accomplish with regard to the wetland creation, with the seawalls, with the berms that you're creating different neighborhoods? How much are we going to be able to preserve, and how will that affect the contours of a city expected to grow to 9 million people within the next 15 years or so?
Right. So as sort of the experience from Hurricane Sandy showed us, we had zero sort of climate or coastal type protections. And so we immediately had to turn on some things that probably should have been done decades ago, because as a coastal city with 520 miles of shoreline, it just was not in place. And so we're doing a lot of those things to protect neighborhoods, but we've also gone through, and with state programs and city programs, acquisitions of certain low-lying and vulnerable areas. And so there's already a neighborhood in Staten Island, Oakwood Beach, that is essentially not there anymore. And there's been some internal movement on Staten Island. There's been people that have moved to New Jersey, and there's been some interesting studies on how those people coped and where they landed. But we're also doing some really interesting work with our city planning department on what we call our resilient neighborhood study, of looking at how land use is a tool for coastal resiliency in particular, and how we deal with, how we can encourage less vulnerability and better building types, and thinking about how we're using our city, knowing what's coming from sea level rise. And some of that is we're making choices now because we have extreme vulnerability, and it's not necessarily practical that we're going to pick up whole neighborhoods all over the city. It is targeted right now, but we're also not precluding other options that might need to happen in the future as we're monitoring what's happening, as we continue to stay ahead of what's happening. But your point around, yes, we are girding and doing things to invest to protect against the impacts that are coming. We are also using every lever we have to cut our greenhouse gas emissions. And the mayor announced first ever building retrofit mandates. Buildings account for 70% of the city's greenhouse gas emission profile. In fact, 1.5% of the city's 1 million buildings account for almost a quarter of the city's total GHG emission profile. The most polluting buildings have an outsized impact on our emissions profile, which is why we announced retrofit mandates that we are working with the council to get passed, that by 2030, people need to come in line and dramatically reduce their fossil fuel burning in buildings for heating and hot water. We are expanding electric vehicle infrastructure. We want to make sure that if people do need cars in this city, they're electric. We have, and your point around the subway is apt, and we need to make sure we are continuing to invest in our subway system that's run by the state, but we're continuing to invest in as well. And all of those things, I think we need to get our own greenhouse gas emissions under control. At the same time, we need to prepare for what changes we've already locked in as a globe. And the last point I'll make before I monopolize this time any further is, when we act as New York City and as the global media capital of the world, people notice. And so it weighs on our team heavily that we need to be out in front, because when we make a move, a lot of other people can actually realize, oh, this can be done, and it gets picked up. And something that might happen in a smaller city that doesn't get the sort of the global pickup in the media happens here, and then it spreads like wildfire. And that happened when we made an 80 by 50 commitment. I think we're going to continue to see, we're already seeing that happen with our fossil fuel litigation and our divestment action, that we're seeing a lot more interest across the globe, Paris and LA and Chicago and others that are exploring options as well, in ways that we have to use that as an amplifying effect and continue to stay out in front to help show how we can solve this crisis. We can't do it alone, but we can be a big part of the solution.
That's a very important point, and I want to come back to that. But I first want to let everybody in the room know that we will have time for your questions. The way that we're going to do that, there should be note cards on every table. And if you can fill out those note cards, Linda Haley and her Dowdy team will be coming around to collect them, and then I will read as many questions as I can and put as many questions together where they belong together. But I have a bunch more questions for our panelists, so you have a little time, and then Linda and company will be around to collect those materials. So, Kanta, I'd like to come back to you and talk a little bit about the kind of global mobilization that Daniel was referring to, specifically in the urban context, New York as an exemplar, making certain interventions. It strikes me that your report points to some gaps in our preparation. Obviously, things that we haven't yet done that we can do, but also things that we haven't necessarily thought about. I was struck, for example, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 13 is the primary climate-focused goal, but it doesn't talk about the kinds of migration preparation that you've highlighted in the report. What kinds of responsive infrastructure, I'm not talking about the individual intervention modalities, but what should we be building to make it possible to do this kind of work and for nations and regions and cities to be able to undertake this kind of preparation?
Thank you. I think that's really important. But I think what Daniel has laid out, and I think one point that he made, which is really important, is what New York City does. Everybody watches and learn. So in the bank, for example, just on the cities, there's a cities resilience program that is working with multiple cities obviously in our client countries in the developing world. And we, in fact, had put out a different report about 2 years ago about urban resilience. And that was equally startling in the context that the cities, which is where there will be a certain number of people gravitating and the cities are going to grow, is that by 2030, there would be 77 million more poor people if we did nothing and we carried on business as usual, and without talking about the greenhouse gas side of it. But the other point, which I think is really important, is that more than 60% of the infrastructure in these cities has not yet been built. So while we're talking about retrofitting in the context of cities that are more mature, there is a whole different kind of opportunity on the way we plan for resilience within cities. And I think the folks who work on the cities and the urban agenda are waking up and really taking attention. So you're talking about low carbon footprint in cities, obviously, and having infrastructure that is resilient. But really this dimension of people moving into city and bringing that to the fore is really important. And in the context of migration, what has happened and tended to happen in a lot of the countries, it's the poorest who are migrating as obviously a last resort. And they arrive and they are probably in slums and in less sort of productive utility of their services. And that needs to happen. So the lens on the human dimension needs to become much more explicit from a resilience perspective as well. And I think that kind of conversations are taking place and pushing very hard on the urban cities resilience program. But equally, I think we talk about sustainable development being an entirety in a country. So the rural areas and the broader communities are really important. So when you talk about in Africa, 70% of the people currently are engaged in agriculture, and they are in rural areas. In South Asia, it's about 50%. In Latin America, it's lower at 15%, obviously. But for a foreseeable future, even with this sort of urban migration, the rural areas remain important. But how we manage that transition, the economic transition, is really important. Take Ethiopia, which was one of the country cases we looked at. It has a population of about 100 million today. And depending on which socioeconomic pathway it takes, it could be anywhere between 165 or 185 million by 2050, which is almost close to double. And there will be a huge youth bulge. Now, currently, the assumption is that, if you want to try to absorb them in agriculture, that's maybe perhaps not viable when you consider also that Ethiopia is a rain-fed agriculture, and although there are some uncertainties in the way global climate models will play out, one really needs to think about how to transit. And there is naturally an emergence of secondary cities. When people's agriculture fail, they tend to go towards secondary cities. So we need to balance investment in kind of secondary cities that are emerging and sprouting, but how do we do it more systematically? But we need to also transition the economy. And the government has noticed and taken and has a target to move, from 40% plus dependency on agriculture to 29. But how we facilitate these transitions, the demographic, the economic, and sustainable development goals, as you say, is critically important. And I just want to make one point to this then. I think the idea of this report was to underscore that migration is happening to the point that Daniel is saying, but the scale of it is going to be really ramping up. And it requires transformative thinking to accommodate that kind of scale. And it requires it to think from now so that we kind of be able to make those transitions a reality.
So what are the assets that we have on the ground? I mean, there are the banks programs, there's the 100 Resilient Cities initiatives, there's former Mayor Bloomberg's efforts coming out of the Ash Center, which to a certain extent swing with the 100 Resilient Cities, but also has an independent series of loops. Is this enough? Is this the germplasm of a response matrix, or is there something more that we can begin in a very deliberate way to do rapidly? Whoever would like to take that?
I want to make a point on this because in terms of resources, two programs come to mind. Maybe this is more of a developed world issue at this point. The idea on acquisitions and buyouts. I think that there were a couple hundred homes in that neighborhood in Staten Island, and I think the total buyout program that came from the state, from federal resources, was something like $150 million for a couple hundred homeowners. The National Disaster Resilience Competition in Louisiana, there's an island out in coastal Louisiana that's the residents are being relocated. Sea level rise is basically swamping the small island. I think there were maybe something like 100 residents there, and we're spending $60 million in resources. So when you start to put numbers like that together and think about the number of people who will be threatened by sea level rise across the coastal United States, the money is just we need a better way to think about how we're going to do this over the next several decades, because that model of we're gonna buy you out, we're gonna make you whole, and you're going to be able to relocate all on the government dime, there's just never going to be enough money to replicate that at scale.
So some of this is moving people away from vulnerable areas and compensating them for the property loss. Some of it is human capital investment. And it strikes me that at least in this country, that's a connection that is rarely made. It's made very elaborately and well in some places like Singapore, for example, which is largely pivoted toward a human capital development agenda as a key aspect of government investment. But I wonder, Brian, if you could talk a little bit about how we begin to jumpstart the human capital dimensions of a problem that most people understand in largely physical terms rather than developmental terms.
And if I might, I actually want to add one point before I address that question.
Please do.
Relative to Daniel's last point. And when we're talking about people moving and programs that move people away, it's important that this happens in an organized fashion and that we not only consider where we're moving people away, but where we're moving people to. And it's quite common when this is an unplanned phenomena that people move out of one type of danger and into another. Mm-hmm. Right. So from a planning perspective, it's very important to keep receiving regions in mind as well, such that policy is oriented around making sure that we're not creating a similar problem elsewhere. In terms of training and programs that are oriented towards developing human capital, I think it's particularly important in the developing world where we do have this youth bulge, where you have a lot of young adults who are just entering their economic prime. And an important point related to that segment of the population is that they do tend to be more likely to move to urban areas, whether it's for work or education. So I think a key point in parts of the developing world is investment in education programs in urban areas up front, anticipating the kind of capacity that's going to be necessary given the population stress that we can expect, not just from climate migration, which is likely to affect or force some people to move into urban areas, but through population stress that results from demographic momentum. We know we're going to see a lot of growth of the younger populations in urban parts of the world, in countries that are going to be undergoing significant economic transition. away from agrarian-oriented societies towards industrial, service-oriented societies. And it's important that the capacity to train a new generation of workers is in place up front to facilitate that type of transition.
Can I add to this
Please.
human capital from the gender perspective? I mean, time and again, I think the literature and the evidence shows us that whether it's an extreme event or whether it's protracted climate migration, there is a sort of a preponderance of the burden on women. And I think there is an increasing amount of evidence to also that's beginning to show that in some cases, if well facilitated, women and girls could benefit from this as well. There are certain demographic transitions underway, which provide job opportunities in cities for girls and women, especially for women, not girls, like in Bangladesh where they have the textile industry. But you want to really make sure that it becomes sort of something that is economically viable and done in the right way. But what we've also found is that investment in education in women can have so many multipliers, not just make them less vulnerable, but have them contribute to the economy. So just wanted to plug that in.
Absolutely. And we might spend some time down the road in different specifically vulnerable populations, subsets of the broader populations at risk. And for those of you who are writing your cards, I've got another round, and then I'd like to get to your cards. So, and I see a couple of cards being waved around here. If we could go ahead and collect those, please. So, I want to turn a little bit to politics, if we may. Not mentioning any names, but this all strikes me as politically very difficult for a couple of reasons.
Can you mention names?
I could, but at one level, this prizes regional action, the kind of regional action. I mean, we think about the Pacific Theater, we think about South Asia, the kinds of units of analysis, and you, of course, brought it down to migration within countries, a country-level analysis. But there are also intensely local decisions being made here. You're picking winners and losers, people to buy out to a certain extent, based on the science, but there are political actions and resistances to some of the kinds of interventions that we'd see. Starting with you, Daniel, how much of a factor does that become in the work that you do? Just the sheer political difficulty of moving people, making investments in certain necessarily places, but even practices that can move across different districts of the city.
No, I think, politics is clear in the work we do, but I think what's important for us is to make sure that we're doing things in an equitable way. And I could use a good example. We've launched a program called Cool Neighborhoods NYC, which is really getting at heat vulnerability here in New York City, and it's a $100 million program. We're planting trees across the city, we're coating roofs white, we're doing the kind of things that you need to do to deal with heat. But we've targeted it in communities that are most heat vulnerable first. And lo and behold, this is not going to surprise anybody, it turns out to be central Brooklyn, the South Bronx, northern Manhattan, where the canopy cover, the poverty, it's communities of color that we need to make sure we're not ignoring in this, that bear a disproportionate burden of the impact of climate change. And to invest in an equitable manner means really focusing on the metrics of equity and putting our money where our mouth is. And that's exactly what we're doing with a program like that. And I think we need to make sure that we are thinking of all of our programs exactly through that lens. And we as a city, by incorporating the concepts of equity across all of our climate action under our One NYC strategic plan, I think we're doing a lot of that. I think we continue to hear feedback on what we can do more on, but we're absolutely focused on those kinds of issues.
Terrific. Let's take that global. Serious political challenges, getting the appropriate national level investment, getting the appropriate regional coordination. What encourages you most and what discourages you most in the form of, perhaps very, very difficult hurdles to scale?
Yeah, let me talk about an example in East Africa. For a long time, you have traditional pastoralists who live in East Africa who've actually moved over large land areas. And a lot of this was across, within the country, but also across the country. And this stress on the land, particularly in terms of getting water for their cattle, has sort of changed their migratory pathways. And as one tries to move across, terrains, it becomes more difficult. But at the same time, I think to make sure that you have those sustainable livelihoods for the pastoralists, it's important that they're allowed to move. So in fact, in the World Bank, we have a regional pastoral livelihood project which facilitates the movement of the pastoralists across the countries so that they are able to sustain their cattle and sustain their livelihoods. And this has required a certain amount of discussion and provision of the components to facilitate that movement, and at the end there is a more sustainable outcome. So I think it's really important when one begins to look and diagnose the issues, and it can be a win-win because it facilitates movement, it has livelihood security, you're thinking ahead of the sending and receiving areas and working out those norms. And what we found in our report is that there will be this emergence of hotspots, within countries, and some of these are close to borders as well. Now, people's movement doesn't stop short at the border, but at the same time, climate could be either an inhibitor or a driver of the movement. So I think having that understanding, having a conversation and dialogue early enough to facilitate those conversations is an important part of that discussion.
Okay, right.
If I could take an even broader global view for a moment, thinking about this at the macro level and how the politics of migration are really presented to the public largely through the media or as the issue is framed by politicians. I see potentially worrying or concerning issues surrounding, for example, how the European migration situation has been framed, constantly referred to as a crisis, providing fodder for ultranationalist organizations or far-right organizations to really take advantage of the situation to promote their own agenda. Less so do you see these types of reactions on the other side of the political spectrum where, with a few exceptions, Germany being one case, where the advantages of the large movement of populations are actually brought to the public forefront. A country like Germany, which has a very low fertility rate and is aging, certainly stands to benefit from an influx of young workers from an economic perspective. And it seems as though that is a perspective that just doesn't resonate as much in the popular media, perhaps because it's not as flashy or doesn't sell as much as, say, a crisis might. And it's particularly troubling because it really feeds into a lot of the extremist movements that we're seeing worldwide. So I think it's important that we think about how we frame this issue and how we present it. And a lot of the responsibility will fall on the media, but politicians in general also should be thinking about how they are explaining these particular situations. Now, on the flip side, certainly we can think about the migration issue again at a multinational, international level as a security issue, where unplanned mass movements of population can be destabilizing. It is important that we think ahead and are able to anticipate where these movements may take place such that we can either help populations to adapt in place or in situations where they may be beneficial moves, we can help to facilitate these moves and do so while informing the population in receiving regions as to the benefits and why this is a positive. It's also an opportunity for countries like the United States that historically the science of climate change hasn't resonated across the entire population. Whereas when you frame climate science as a potential security issue, you certainly can appeal to a broader segment of the population, and perhaps there's an opportunity there to create more consensus concerning how we treat the science moving forward.
So the rhetoric, the language, the framing questions really become critical in enjoining political support.
Extremely.
Okay. You folks have made my life very difficult. You've asked great questions. There are 22 of them, and most of them don't overlap. So I won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to start right at the top, and I'll combine where I can. The first question is that is encouraged by the city. Migration in New York continues toward the waterfront. If we accept the 6-foot sea level rise by 2100, what is the city's comprehensive plan to deal with this? And Daniel, I think that's for you.
Oh, really? Okay. No, it's I mean, it's something that we are keenly aware of. The climate science, whether right now we're building and planning really out to the 2050s projections with an eye towards what's out in 2100, and that's a pretty long time horizon for most planning purposes. but it's still daunting. And whether we're looking at 2.5 or so of feet of sea level rise, that will still have an impact on our coastal communities. And we've done some look at this, and 2.5 feet of sea level rise basically means that 8% of the city's shoreline gets overtopped basically at high tide every day. So it's certainly noticeable. It's not yet catastrophic. The 6 feet scenarios, that is a dramatically reshaped New York City, and that is right now our 90th percentile projection for 2100. So it's the high end, or I would hesitate to use the word worst case, but it's definitely the high end of our scientific projections right now. But we have vulnerability now, and so I have scientists that are walking around New York City showing what maps of New York City will look like with 30 meters of sea level rise. I don't find those sort of apocalyptic things helpful in the very near term. We need to be aware of what's coming. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but we need to protect New Yorkers where they are now and be smart about how we're planning. And that is why we are investing in our coastal protections. We are upgrading our bulkheads and working with the federal government and the Army Corps on coastal protections in very vulnerable neighborhoods now. That's why we're doing land use planning, and that's why we're looking at, in our coastal communities, all the different types of neighborhoods, whether it's a broad channel in Queens or the East Shore of Staten Island or Locust Point in the Bronx. We're understanding what are all the different scenarios, what do the projections of climate change mean, and how can we build differently and better? And in some cases, how do we build so that we are reducing vulnerability and reducing density? And we're already starting to put those kinds of things into our zoning code through a coastal designation to help limit risk. So this is complicated. The term that we use that comes from our scientific advisors is this flexible adaptation pathways. We're not trying to solve for the year 2100 with everything we do today, but we are mindful of those projections. We're investing now, and we're trying to do it in a way that we can either build on those things that we're doing now or that don't preclude other decisions in the future. And so we think it's a smart approach for dealing with risk with limited resources, but with an eye towards the future. And that becomes really complicated and hard to explain sometimes, but it's, I think, a smart approach for dealing with growing risks of climate change.
There is one strain of questions that actually does allow me to put some things together, and I'll put it this way. A number of people have heard the human capital argument loud and clear, and they ask 2 questions. First, what kinds of careers should students be preparing for as they look toward a landscape shaped by climate migration and climate more generally? That's the A point. And the B point is, what should universities be doing in terms of their curricula or in terms of their research programs, but principally in terms of curricula, to help populations develop exactly the kind of capital that we're talking about here? And I think all 3 of you might have something to say about this.
Yeah, maybe just to start off, I think there's two things that from where I'm sitting that are really important. One is a more specific thing. To start off with, trying to do good research that really brings evidence-based, based on the best science, the best economic analysis. I think that is something that is sometimes lacking because there are lots of general statements thrown out there that become sort of common. Just for example, the Syrian context. I mean, there is a debate amongst the academics. Was it really fueled by climate change? Was that just one small contributing factor, or was it something important? But that's just one example. But generally, I think an evidence-based approach, drawing on the best science, drawing on the economics, the socioeconomics, I think that would be really useful. The other is, I think, not that everybody needs to become multidisciplinary, but I think more and more the complexity, at least from the climate perspective, is such a cross-cutting issue. It touches on every aspect of development, especially from the resilience side even more, that one needs to sort of begin to have that kind of lens to a problem. And not to make everybody a generalist, but to be able to harness those kinds of skill sets and data and information to advise decision makers, to advise policy makers. That's where I think from the perspective of the World Bank, we've recognized climate change as both a challenge and an opportunity. And when one begins to work on climate resilience, it's not a sector, it's not a pillar, it really cuts across. And constantly you challenge between trade-offs. And so I think that kind of approach would be really important, and that kind of thinking.
If I can piggyback a bit off of Kanta's points, I do think from a curriculum perspective, interdisciplinary research is extremely important. Historically, we've been siloed into our specific academic segments, and it's part of the reason that climate science advanced so far beyond the social science of climate change over the past 3 decades. It took a while for the physical scientists and the human scientists to actually get on the same page. So again, we don't expect everybody to have expertise in, say, migration and climate science, but being able to speak across disciplines and having enough broad exposure to different disciplines to be able to collaborate is going to be extremely important in the future as we deal with this particular issue. So a migration expert, for example, that understands the nuts and bolts of climate science to the degree that they can implement that kind of information into modeling approaches will be extremely important. A related but somewhat different point I'd like to mention is renewable energy. And we have an opportunity right now in this country where the price of education is quite high. We have a lot of populations that are struggling to send children to college. And there's a shortage when it comes to labor in engineering and support for many of our renewables, solar and wind power, for example. And I know I've seen a few students out here actually, so you will have heard this in class. But there's a real opportunity for Americans to make use of our very comprehensive community college system to implement programs related to the development of a labor force that is equipped to service and deal with renewable energy technologies, both on a broad, large industrial scale and down to the level of the private homeowner. And these are careers that are potentially quite lucrative, but may require less in the way of upfront investment if we take advantage of some of the educational infrastructure that's already in place.
There's a question that I can weave in here. Somebody wants to know how the current administration, thinking Washington, not Gracie Mansion, how does the current administration's policies affect the prospect of dealing with these questions? And with regard, for example, to mobilizing a renewable service population through our community colleges, probably not on the agenda short term. Does that reshape what we can think about, or does that just simply push the decision-making apparatus to states and localities?
I would think it does the latter. It requires that the states become more involved. And there's a real opportunity there at different levels of governance for states to be very proactive. And we've already seen this in many areas where states like New York and California have really been at the forefront of reacting to the climate crisis in the absence of federal leadership. Certainly changes we've seen at the Department of Education related to higher education are such that there's not likely to be a comprehensive program oriented around renewables and education at the national level. But the opportunity is there at the state level. And there are several states, Iowa, for example, that have already invested heavily in these types of programs. And anyone who's traveled through Iowa will see the landscape is such that you have farmland that is dotted with wind farms where agriculture has been essentially married to this renewable energy idea, and it's a kind of a win-win in that agricultural communities that have been struggling are realizing some income through leases on sites for wind turbines, but they're able to maintain agricultural production as well. So there are examples out there of this already happening.
And better than ethanol.
Absolutely.
We have several questions about how we know what we know about climate migrants. And I'd like to toss this first over to Brian. How do we know, and you had alluded to this earlier, that migration is actually prompted by climate change rather than something else, economic opportunity, fear of political oppression, whatever it might be? And how can we convince people that that's what's going on? What's the evidence that you lay on the table when you want to make that case?
So there's a couple of approaches. And again, I want to step back and agree or reiterate that this is a really difficult problem. This is a tough phenomenon to model. What we have done is, again, we avoid simply looking at things like temperature change and precipitation in our models and assuming that those are going to be the factors that are going to drive people to move. It may be, in the case of extreme heat in urban areas, that you may see some movement out of cities in the future. But primarily, particularly in the developing world, it's when economic livelihoods are at risk that you start to see people leave their homes and look for either alternative economic activities or other places where they may be able to engage in the same livelihood. In order to assess the degree to which these types of changes are for example, I'll refer back to the report, water stress and crop yields are actually affecting movement, we run a number of scenarios, one of which we'll refer to as a counterfactual, where we will remove only the impact of crops and water from the historic validation model and run the model projecting forward to current day to see how close we can get to actually projecting the movement we saw. And then we'll include those changes in the model and then run the model again and look at the difference between the two. And that's the primary method we used to look at the changes that have occurred because we're controlling for a single factor. Right? We're holding everything else constant and saying, here we're introducing climate impacts on livelihoods, and here we're leaving it out. What is the difference in outcomes? And what we found when we did this, starting from a historic time period and moving forward to present day to try and project and see how well we could model historic change, that the model that included changes to crop yields and water shortages, so agricultural livelihoods, performed better and did a better job capturing the actual distribution of the population over time. So that's the argument we really put forth to suggest that we're onto something, if you will.
Terrific. Did you want to get
maybe
into this?
just very quickly to add to that, I think to the question that you said, and just to complement what Brian said, I think the motivating factor for an individual at an individual level that makes them migrate is multiple forces. It could be socioeconomic, it could be, economic alone, it could be maybe even political, and climate increasingly. I think what we tried to do here was, recognizing that there are multiple factors that drive an individual, including their social networks. We tried to sort of isolate out how is climate as a driver attributing at that scale through the methodology that Brian said. And that also is really important because to add to what Brian said as an example, in Bangladesh we found that when you do this counterfactual and look at climate migrants, by 2050 in a highly climate vulnerable country, climate migrants will outpace the sort of regular economic type migrants. And that's because of its vulnerability. Now, that doesn't play out equally everywhere. In Ethiopia, climate migrants will be in the realm of about 15% in 2050 because economic migrants will still prevail, economic drivers will still prevail, recognizing what I said about a country that is highly challenged, even from the development perspective. So I think what we try to do here is to isolate out climate in some way, and I think the overall understanding is climate will be an important emergent potent factor, because when you think about 143 million people, it's just not people, it's individuals, it's families, with all the sort of impacts that come from that.
Does your research team or have other research teams done surveys about supposed climate migrants or people who are vulnerable to climate migration?
There have been sort of the agent-based modeling studies that have looked at, as we mentioned, at the anecdotal, at the case study level, that begin to show that these kind of factors are playing in. IOM has what they call a data tracking monitor, and more they find that weather and climate-induced factors are sort of pushing people to move, not necessarily always for a long term, but it's becoming a factor that's important to consider.
There are many more good questions here. I can't get to all of them, I'm afraid, but what I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists to close with a wish. If you had to make a choice about a policy that you wish that we could see enacted to mitigate this problem, either from a greenhouse gas reduction point of view, or I hope more particularly from this migration point of view, what might that be? And we'll begin with Brian and come back toward me.
It's a big question. I think it's, I think, again, I want to step back and just from an agenda setting point of view, I want to stress the importance of making sure that this phenomena is not put out into the public sphere as a crisis. This is a situation that is likely to occur. We've seen this kind of thing in the past. There have been mass migrations in the past. It's more that we are able to deal with it. From a policy perspective, I do think the key is understanding how regional, at the subnational level, patterns are likely to evolve so that we can plan for both sending and receiving regions. And when receiving regions appear to be in danger as well, that it is important that we develop policy that steers migrants away from additional danger and towards areas that are likely to be somewhat safe from a climate perspective. And that's going to involve developing an economic plan that allows for people to actively engage in perhaps a different type of economic activity. So there needs to be a comprehensive plan that involves looking at the potential pathways, making sure we're not moving people from harm's way into harm's way again, and then given the types of patterns that we'd like to see, what are the economic implications and how can we effectively train populations to prepare for these outcomes?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. What I'd like to complement what Brian said, but just want to bring home the fact that in looking at this climate migration development nexus, I think this report that the World Bank Group put out with the partners, it really underscores that this is the human phase of climate change. Migration is a human phase. And I think the second point we'd like to make and convey is that the scale of it will ramp up, but it is not unmanageable. And we really have this window of opportunity between now and 2030 or 2050 to make it different. And while it will be a reality because we are locked into some level of climate emissions already, it doesn't have to become a crisis. And what we do here and now can make all that difference with concrete climate and development action coming together at a global level for some of it with greenhouse gas emissions, but at the development level, working at the local and national level with better information at the outset. I think we can really be in a better place and look forward to that kind of reaction to these kinds of issues towards very concrete action.
Thank you. Daniel, you have the last word.
I mean, these are incredibly challenging questions, and I think you're right that it should not necessarily be pitched as a crisis, but I think history has shown that these are incredibly challenging movements of people, and it's not just so easy to adapt. And so part of my answer here is that we need a better federal partner to have real climate policy that has real policy around immigration, and right now we don't have that, so please vote. Can't understate that more importantly, but I'm sure I'm speaking to a choir here, or preaching to a choir here. The second is I think I would like to see more, and I'm proud of what our immigration office has done here in New York City with things like IDNYC and making us more welcoming and inclusive as a city, and making sure that people are able to access the services they need when they do arrive in New York City, given whatever their circumstances might be. I'm continually shocked when I think about the statistic that something like 40% of New Yorkers were not born in the United States. New York City residents were not born in the United States. We are continually a city that is a beacon for folks who are on the move. And I think we've done a good job of being welcoming and inclusive, and we continue to do more of that. And I'd like to see more of that across the country as well.
Terrific. Thank you all for a wonderful conversation. Let me remind you, please, you have on your tables an evaluation form. Please fill it out and make sure somebody picks that up before you leave us today. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your great questions. Please join me in thanking our panel for a terrific conversation this morning. Thank you.